I first noticed her the day the rain seeped through the skylight of the repair shop, turning the concrete floor into a slick mirror. She was bent over the counter, inspecting an old motorcycle part with that effortless authority you only see in people who have spent years knowing their own minds. Mid-40s, sharp navy blazer, sleeves rolled up, hair tucked behind one ear, and eyes that seemed to catalog everything without judgment. The kind of woman who doesn't need you to explain yourself, because she already understands more than you can admit. I was 24, fumbling with a wrench, trying to keep the oil from dripping onto my shirt, and feeling the kind of self-conscious heat that only happens when someone notices you in the exact moment you feel clumsy. She looked up, just for a second, as if catching my hesitation in slow motion. There was a flicker, almost imperceptible, a tiny raise of her eyebrow, the corner of her mouth twitching like she wanted to smile, but didn't. I wanted to speak, to say something clever or at least polite, but all I could manage was a tight nod. "Careful with that," she said finally, voice calm, smooth, the kind that could make instructions feel like confessions. "It bites if you're not paying attention." Her words were ordinary, yet something in the way she said them, the slight pause before the last syllable, the soft tilt of her head, made me feel like she was looking right through me. I wanted to tell her, "I've been careful for hours, but suddenly I'm not." Instead, I said nothing, letting the awkwardness stretch between us, an unspoken electricity that made my palms sweat. Later, she handed me a rag without a word, just that subtle movement, and I felt my chest tighten. My fingers brushed hers, a brush of skin so light it could have been accidental, but neither of us moved away. I wanted to see if she noticed it too, but she didn't look at me. She never looked at me in the way you hope someone will, yet the fact she didn't, that she didn't need to, made my stomach lurch. The hours passed like this, her leaning over engines, me pretending to work, yet my eyes always straying. There was an ease to her presence that made me both bold and timid at the same time. She could talk about anything, gears, invoices, the weather, and still make it feel intimate, like she was inviting me to sit closer without saying a word. At one point, I dropped a bolt. It rolled across the floor, stopping at her boot. She bent, picked it up, and handed it back. Our fingers brushed again. This time, I dared a small, ridiculous smile. She returned it with a half-smirk, not amused exactly, more like tolerating. And in that fraction of a second, the room felt warmer, smaller, as if we were the only two people who had ever noticed each other. She looked away first, checking a clipboard, tapping it lightly, like she had better things to do. I couldn't stop staring. My mind went to that moment again and again. The way her hair caught the light, the way her hand lingered on the bolt, the almost imperceptible sigh she let out when she handed it back. I left the shop that evening with my uniform streaked in grease, my heart stuck somewhere between admiration and longing, replaying that small, silent gesture over and over. It was absurd, really, the weight of it, but I couldn't shake it. And I knew, already, that I was chasing something I wasn't supposed to understand yet, something she would never let me claim, but that I would carry with me anyway. She didn't know it yet, but she had slipped inside me like a secret I couldn't confess, and I was already lost. The next day, I found myself back at the shop before my shift really started, mostly because I couldn't stop thinking about the way she moved. She was already there, leaning over a disassembled engine on the bench, hair tied loosely this time, strands escaping around her face like she'd given up pretending everything was perfectly in place. "Morning," I said, fumbling with the rag in my hands. She didn't look up at first, just hummed something under her breath and continued twisting a bolt. The sound was faint, almost like a sigh trapped in a melody, and for a moment I wondered if it was meant for me. I stepped closer to help her lift the engine block, feeling the weight in my arms, feeling the same tension that seemed to coil between us every time our space overlapped. Her hands were steady, but there was a slight tremor when she set it down. I noticed everything. The faint shadows under her eyes, the way she exhaled after the effort, the small crease between her brows she probably thought no one could see. "Careful," she muttered, almost to herself. Her voice was lighter than yesterday, but still distant, like she was letting me in only a fraction of the way. I nodded, adjusting my grip, trying not to let my observation slip into awkwardness. It was ridiculous. I was staring at her hands while she was dealing with engine parts, but I couldn't stop. There was something in the way she held herself, a careful balance of competence and fragility, like she had built walls around herself that were nearly impossible to scale. When the engine finally rested on the stand, she leaned back and rubbed her temples, eyes closing for just a second. I wanted to say something, anything, but she opened her eyes before I could, and the moment passed. I caught a flicker of vulnerability there, though, a hint that she carried more than she admitted. "Thanks," she said quietly. Her words were barely audible, but the way she said them carried weight, like she was apologizing for letting me see something private. I smiled, awkwardly, and she finally looked at me, a small, fleeting acknowledgement that maybe she noticed me noticing her. Her lips quirked, almost like she wanted to tease, but stopped herself. My chest tightened. We worked in silence for a few more minutes, the shop filled with the smell of oil and the faint hiss of air compressors. Every so often, our hands brushed when passing tools, and each time a spark seemed to jump in that tiny space between us. She didn't pull away, but she didn't linger either. Then, just before I left, she looked up from the engine and gave me a glance that lasted a heartbeat longer than necessary. Something unspoken passed in that second, an acknowledgement of curiosity, maybe caution, maybe the beginning of trust. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Her eyes alone said enough to make me ache quietly in my chest. And as I walked out of the shop, I couldn't stop replaying that moment, that subtle charge, that silent invitation she would never voice but had just given anyway. I was drawn to her, tethered in a way I didn't understand yet, and I knew I'd come back, just to feel that pull again. It was late. The shop was almost empty, the rain hammering against the skylight again, tapping out a rhythm that seemed to match my heartbeat. She was wiping down the counter, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, and I couldn't help but notice the way the light hit her skin, warm, alive, and entirely untouchable. We were close, closer than usual. Just the two of us, the engines cooled, the tools put away, and the silence stretching like a fragile wire between us. I wanted to say something. The words had been circling my chest all day, but I didn't. Instead, I offered to grab us some coffee, pretending the steam rising from the mugs would give me courage. "Black," she murmured, her voice low, almost lost in the sound of rain. I nodded and went to the small corner kitchenette. The air smelled faintly of wet concrete and motor oil, and somewhere in that mixture, I found myself imagining 1,000 ways to get closer to her without speaking a word. I returned with the cups, setting hers down with a careful hand. Our fingers brushed, again, and this time, I felt the warmth linger, just for a heartbeat. She didn't react, but I saw it, saw the quick tilt of her chin and the brief catch in her breath. My chest tightened, my mind scrambling for a plausible excuse to stay within this dangerous orbit. We sipped in silence for a few moments. Then, she sighed, looking out at the rain-streaked window. "I didn't expect anyone to stick around in this weather," she said, almost like she was talking to herself. "Me neither," I replied, though I wasn't entirely honest. I was here because I wanted to be. Because every second with her made me aware of everything I'd never noticed before. The slight fatigue in her hands, the quiet steadiness of her movements, the faint tension she carried even when she seemed relaxed. A sudden vibration on the counter made both of us start. Her phone lit up, a name I didn't recognize. She glanced at it, hesitated, and then silenced it. The pause was telling. Something had passed between her and whoever it was. A reminder that her life existed beyond this room, beyond me. I wanted to reach out, to ask if she was okay, but I stayed still. I knew some lines couldn't be crossed, not yet. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear and turned her attention back to me, the briefest flicker of a smile touching her lips. For a moment, we existed in that suspended space, so close that I could feel her warmth, so close that I almost imagined pressing my hand against hers. Almost imagined letting her lean against me. My heart jumped, and I realized just how foolish it would be to act. Not tonight. Not yet. She leaned forward to set her cup down, and our knees brushed under the counter. My breath caught. The world narrowed to that small, electric contact, and then, like a tide pulling away, she shifted, stepping back, breaking the closeness we'd been orbiting. And just like that, it was over. The almost confession, the near touch, the dangerous spark, gone. But it lingered in the air, in my chest, in the rhythm of my pulse long after she'd walked to the back, leaving me staring at the rain and the memory of what nearly happened. I wanted to reach for her. I wanted to tell her everything. But I stayed still, holding back, and letting the storm outside echo the storm inside. The shop smelled of wet asphalt and oil, the remnants of the storm still clinging to the air. She was leaning against the workbench, arms crossed, shoulders slightly hunched, and I could feel the distance in her posture even before she spoke. I didn't move closer. I didn't dare. For a long moment, we just watched each other. No tools, no tasks, just that weight between us. Her eyes were sharp, searching, but unreadable. I wanted to break the silence, to say something that would make the tension tangible, but the words I wanted felt inadequate, even absurd. Finally, she let out a small sigh, almost a tremor. "What are we doing?" she asked, her voice quiet, deliberate, trembling just enough to betray the control she always seemed to have. I froze. The question was simple, but it carried the weight of every glance, every brush of fingers, every almost touch. I opened my mouth, closed it again. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, and in it, I felt exposed in ways I hadn't expected. I don't know," I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Saying it aloud made it real, more real than anything I'd imagined. She studied me, eyes narrowing just slightly, not in anger, but in careful assessment. The air between us seemed to vibrate with the things we couldn't say, the tension of unspoken desires and boundaries. I could see the exhaustion in her hands, the subtle crease in her forehead, the way she seemed older all at once, like life had placed invisible weights on her shoulders I had no right to touch. We didn't speak again for a while. I watched the rain streak down the skylight, her figure reflected in the wet concrete floor. Every small movement she made, the tilt of her head, the tightening of her grip on the bench, the way she exhaled sharply, became amplified in my mind. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to erase the distance. But something in her aura, in the careful line of her jaw, held me back. Then, almost as if confessing to herself more than to me, she whispered, I can't let this happen." Her voice cracked on the last word, a brittle sound that echoed in the empty shop. I nodded slowly, trying to hide the sudden ache in my chest. I wanted to argue, to beg her to redefine her rules, but I didn't. I could only stand there, watching her shoulders relax slightly as she turned away, like she had just unburdened herself and now needed space to breathe. And in that moment, the thing that cut deepest wasn't rejection. It was the quiet truth of her words, the unspoken acknowledgement that I was caught in something I couldn't name, couldn't claim, and might never understand. I wanted to tell her. I wanted to scream it into the storm outside, but all I could do was watch her leave a part of herself behind and feel my own fracture in its place. It was quiet that evening, the shop dimly lit, shadows pooling in the corners. She was sitting on the edge of the workbench, a faded photograph in her hands, fingers tracing the edges as if memorizing every crease. I leaned against the counter, pretending to organize tools, but my eyes kept drifting to her. She didn't look up at me immediately. When she finally did, her eyes were softer, vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen before. I lost someone," she said, voice barely above a whisper. There was no prelude, no flourish, just the simple, devastating admission. I hesitated. There's 1,000 ways you could respond, but the right one is always the one you don't know yet. "I'm sorry," I said. Too small, too clumsy, but it was honest. She nodded, her fingers still brushing the photo. He meant everything to me. And then, just like that, he wasn't there anymore. I thought I'd learned to move on, to close that chapter. But sometimes, her voice trailed off, and I realized the words she didn't speak were the ones that burned the most. I stepped closer, careful to respect the invisible boundary she hadn't yet defined. I know he's gone, I murmured. But maybe the memory doesn't have to hurt you every day. Maybe it can just exist. My own voice sounded hollow even to me, but I couldn't stop myself from speaking. She looked at me then, really looked, as if weighing whether I was intruding or understanding. You don't know him, she said. And yet, the faint tremor in her hands told me she was testing me, hoping I might understand anyway. The photograph fell face down onto the bench with a soft thud, and she buried her face in her hands. I wanted to reach for her, to hold her, but I stayed frozen, knowing that the smallest gesture could either heal or shatter the fragile honesty she had just offered. I didn't think anyone would notice, she whispered, lifting her head just slightly. Her eyes glistened with the kind of quiet hurt that has nowhere to go. Not really. I swallowed. I notice, I said, the words steadier than I felt. I see you. Even the parts you don't say. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that carried both relief and resignation. And in that instant, the shop felt different. The weight between us hadn't lifted, but it had shifted, a subtle realignment, like the earth beneath your feet just moved slightly, enough to unsettle everything you thought was solid. Her gaze drifted back to the photo, tracing the image with a finger. I stood there, silent, knowing that the confession, small, fragile, human, had opened a door neither of us could close, whether we wanted to or not. And in that quiet moment, I realized she had just let me in, not fully, but enough to know that nothing would ever be the same again. The shop smelled faintly of engine oil and rain, a comfortable combination that now seemed infused with something else, something softer, more immediate. She was crouched by a workbench, adjusting a loose bolt, and I knelt beside her, our knees brushing just enough to make my chest tighten. Not with panic this time, but with a strange, calm certainty. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The air between us had shifted subtly over the past weeks, through rain-soaked evenings, quiet confessions, and near confessions alike. Now, silence felt like understanding. I watched her hands, strong and capable, moving with care. My fingers itched to reach out, and without thinking, I rested the back of my hand lightly against hers. She froze for a heartbeat, just a slight hitch in her breathing, and then she let her hand remain under mine. Not as a question, not as permission, but as acknowledgement. We stayed like that for a long time, the only sounds the faint drip of water from the skylight and our measured breathing. She finally glanced up, and for the first time in weeks, her eyes held no barrier. No hesitation, no wall, just presence. I suppose, she murmured, voice low and even, we can't pretend anymore. No, I whispered back. We can't. The words were small, simple, almost unnecessary. They didn't need to be grand declarations. They were quiet, honest admissions of what had already been unfolding between us, undeniable and patient. She exhaled, leaning back slightly, but didn't move away. I could feel the subtle warmth of her, the rhythm of her heartbeat through the small space between us. It was intimate in the way shared silence can be, in the way understanding without words can settle something inside you. Our knees brushed again, a small reminder that proximity had become inevitable. I let a fingertip graze hers, testing the connection, and she didn't pull away. She let her gaze drop to the small touch, then back to me, and a flicker of something, relief, acceptance, maybe even anticipation, crossed her face. Time seemed to stretch around us, measured in the quiet acknowledgement that we no longer had to hide the tension, the longing, the subtle pull that had been building. There were no dramatic gestures, no declarations of love, just a shared recognition that the space between us had collapsed gently, entirely, and irreversibly. She leaned back against the bench, her shoulder brushing mine. I rested my forehead lightly against the side of hers, just for a moment, feeling her exhale settle against me. That single, small gesture, so minimal, so human, carried everything that words could not. And then we stayed there, in the quiet, letting it all exist without needing to name it further. Not perfect, not resolved, not fairy tale, but true. For the first time, I felt that maybe this, whatever this was between us, could exist quietly, fully, without forcing anything else. And that was enough. I think about that night often, the one after the rain, when everything shifted without fanfare. The shop smelled faintly of oil and wet concrete, but more than that, it smelled of us, of presence, understanding, and quiet surrender. Looking back, I can see how far we had both come. She had let walls slip, if only a fraction, revealing vulnerability I didn't have the right to claim, but that she allowed me to witness. And I had learned patience in a way I hadn't known I needed. I had learned that closeness isn't measured in words or grand gestures, but in stillness, small touches, and being truly seen. It didn't resolve everything. There were still storms, still moments of hesitation, and the kind of messiness that comes with being human. But we existed differently after that night. There was trust now, not blind or careless, but deliberate. Mutual acknowledgement that whatever this was, quiet, fragile, urgent, belonged to us as long as we nurtured it. I remember her smile that first morning after the shift, faint, almost shy, yet layered with warmth and confidence. I remember the subtle brush of her hand when passing a wrench, the way she let me hold her coffee for a moment longer than needed. Those little things weren't declarations. They weren't fireworks. They were truth, a slower, steadier flame that I could carry inside me. And me? I had stopped being the boy who only admired from the edges. I could now exist beside her, comfortably, honestly, without needing to chase or prove anything. Love, I realized, wasn't always about confession or claiming. Sometimes it was about attention, presence, patience. Sometimes it was about choosing to stay in the quiet, even when desire whispered differently. We never needed to say it aloud. The feeling was there, embedded in the spaces we shared, in the warmth of proximity, in the moments neither of us could forget. The subtle intimacy of two flawed, stubborn adults learning to navigate something rare and unforced. I left the shop that evening with grease on my hands and a weight in my chest, but it wasn't the heavy ache of longing. It was the gentle thrum of understanding. We had survived the tension, the almost confessions, the ghosts of past heartbreaks. We had arrived here, to quiet recognition, and it was enough. And now, when I think of her, I don't think of what I can't have. I think of what we share, the quiet, unspoken bond that has settled into me like a familiar song. A song that doesn't need lyrics, because the melody says it all. We learned, I suppose, that love doesn't always need to roar. Sometimes it just exists, patient, steady, and quietly transformative. If you've ever felt that kind of love, the kind that changes you without a single dramatic word, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your story.